Hello, everyone, and welcome to our shows today. In today's conversation, together with my guest, we will try to understand, we will try to navigate, try to unpack what kind of the international order currently we are in. As some scholars argue that we already transit from unipolar order to multipolar world order, but at the same times, some other scholars they argue that we are different kind of the multipolar order. Yes, there is a different pole now, specifically after the 2008 financial crisis. China rising as another superpower in terms of the economy and right now technology and military capability. But most recently, there is some important development taking place across the Middle East and African region. When we go to the Palestine, that is 7 October, I think there will be a most important historical point when the Hamas attack on Israel, and it became like a Pandora box of the region. And later, as most of you know, the Iran in Lebanon, Hezbollah involved to the conflict and ongoing war between Hamas in Gaza and Israel. Later, from the Yemen across the Red Sea, Houthi involvement as a part of the Iranian proxies. They shut up down the Red Sea, the international trader ships. They turn their directions from the Red Sea, which is the most, I think, busiest trade passage channel for international trade in terms of the economy, goods, oil, gas, whatever you think. And little bit later, there was another formation of the coalition, interestingly forming when we see between the Gulf countries. There was a friction, especially between the GCC countries, with the recognition of Israel to the Somaliland, and later the Saudi Arabia's attack on UAE bases across the MENA. Across the Yemen and some Yemeni archipelagos, islands like Socotra, and just most recent, when we come to the today's situation currently ongoing, there is a big war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. I think it will be 10th day of the Iran war. The United States and Israel target all important military infrastructure, strategic infrastructure in across Iran. Iran, of course, in response, they launching missiles toward the Gulf countries, specifically in Dubai, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Most recently, another 2 missiles coming toward Turkey. These missiles has been intercepted by NATO's air defense systems and Navy from Mediterranean. Yes, the situation is different. On the other hand, just before we have Venezuelan case, United States involved to Venezuela, and there is a North Korea still carefully watching the situation, and U.S.-China relations on other hand. And of course, we have Ukraine and Russian war there continue on other hand. And this complex of international relations seems to different than the unipolar or bipolar order. And today, to understand, I have really an experienced guest. He's Bernardo Navazo López. He's a director and founder of Geopolitical Insights in EU. Before founding Geopolitical Insights, Bernardo served as a senior analyst at Spanish Prime Minister Office between 2018 to 2020. He contributing to intergovernmental consultations on technology, defense, and geopolitics, and I think his area of experience is greatly fit to our topic. And welcome, Bernardo. Thank you very much for joining my show.
Thank you very much, Lokman, for the invitation.
Yes, as I said, tell something in the initial procedure. We are really operating in different international order, I think, and I really wonder to listen your experience, your observations. how do you see the transition, especially from the 20th century's international systems into the new multipolar area, changing the way for a major power conflict like the current, specifically ongoing war between the US, Israel, and Iran, and how will be managed on the global stage? What will be your take?
Well, those are very good questions, and I think that are the questions that are gonna, we're gonna be focusing on them for at least the one related to the international system for several decades, and the one about the conflict is a little bit more contextual. So if you don't mind, I think that we can separate and start talking about the international system, and then focus a little bit more on the context and what's going on today at the Middle East, which I'm not an expert, but I think that understanding a little bit the international system can help provide some answers, or at least some structural directions.
Yes.
Again, thank you very much, Lokman, for having me today and being with your audience. It's a pleasure. I'm always talking with people
You're welcome.
people that are interested and is interesting about these topics. Is always a pleasure. Not that I wanna, talk a little bit about my biography, but I think that there is like a certain point that is gonna explain why we look at my company and myself, why we look today's reality the way we look. And it's the fact that by chance, I had the opportunity to study my Master of International Affairs at Columbia and at that university in New York City. And at that time, I had the chance to take a class with Kenneth Wolf. I think that everybody knows, he's one of the greatest scholars,
internationalist and theorist.
Super theorist. And at the very same time, his focus of expertise was always thinking about not talking about labels, social labels like democracy, autocracy, because those are social labels that each society impose onto each other. But let's talk about and let's focus on the structural things, about power, balance of power, who is more powerful relative to another. And then he was also focusing, and he was an expert on the Cold War and about bipolar systems and that theory. So I was lucky enough at that time, it was 2008, 2010, to form a relationship and have like some kind of friendship with this, major figure of international relation who shaped my way of looking at the international system. Which means that when I was working with them, I read through many of the literature related to the 60s, the 70s, the 50s, and the formation in the late 40s of the bipolar war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So if we come today, and this is just a biographical point about my experience, I think that it can help the audience to understand why we look at this situation today with those lenses. I think that looking at today's world, I think that everybody agrees that there was a Cold War, that it was the Soviet Union against the United States, that there were two different systems, two different realities, two different spaces for culture, for sports, two different ways of doing technology, of doing science. Like, for example, when you are talking about the space, the US started to use the GPS, the Global Positioning System, with very specific ways of putting satellites on orbit in what it is called the geosynchronous orbit, while the Soviet Union was doing another different kind of technology to do space surveillance, and they were doing something that was called Molniya orbit. So in every single human activity, be it sports, culture, pop culture, science, technology, and politics, there were two different blocks. There was two different trade organizations. The Comecon at the Soviet Union, within the Soviet Union, and the General Agreements of Tariffs and Trade that eventually became the WTO, the World Trade Organization. There were two different military alliances. You had the Warsaw Pact for the Soviet Union, and you have NATO for the US allies. So every single one of these polars, of these poles, of these great powers, created this set of alliances that covered and this is important, every single aspect of human civilization, be it sports, culture, soap operas, technology, science, digital, anything and everything. And the competition among them was persistent in every single vertical of these activities. It was ideological, it was related to culture, it was related to sports. And I think that everybody that was brought up, as I did in the 80s, I think that we can remember the competition about how many gold medals every single one of these blocks won at the Olympic Games, or sports, with the US focusing much more on athleticism and tracking and running, and the US and Soviet Union focusing more on chess or on gymnastics or on heavy lifting. So as you can see, the dynamics of that bipolar world was overall competition in every single aspect of human civilization. I think that everybody agrees that that kind of like ended in 1989 through 1991, and then eventually, since the early decade of the 90s through, let's say, 2010, 2012, in any case, around that area, it was a period of expansion of the US, which everybody agrees that it was called Pax Americana, which basically meant there was a unipolar power running most of the geography of the world, and that meant that everybody was used to their culture, to their sports, to their way of having fun, to their leisure, to the technology, to the way they do the auditing at firms, with the big four like KPMG, Pricewaterhouse, and McKinsey being the one leading how we organize labor, military alliances, and again, every single aspect of human civilization was governed by the way of the US of doing things. And that relates that if you were working at the Spanish office of the Prime Minister, or at the German office of the Prime Minister, or in Morocco, or in Latin America, pretty much in every single country of the world, you were asking, what does the US thinks about whatever is going on local politics? So the end of our understanding of politics always pointed to Washington. And you could see that in almost every single country. Needless to say, there was some countries that were reluctant to get into that dominance. And you can talk about China, you can talk perhaps about India in some sense, you can centrally talk about Iran, and you can also talk about Russia after a process of understanding that they do not want it to belong fully to that dominance. And that was 2015, 2016. So now let's get back, or let's go to that area that was 10 years ago, 2015, 2016. We saw what was called at the time the BTP effect, the Brexit, Trump, and Putin effect. And it was the Brexit in 2016, June, July, the first election of Trump in the American election in 2016. And then it was also the Putin effect, that Putin was getting more aggressive and focusing perhaps on the Crimea area in 2014, when in February they seized that part of the territory. And the general feeling of everybody that was interested in politics and international politics was the US is in retreat. They are thinking that they are not getting any benefits from sustaining how expensive this global system is, in terms of like making sure that all the lanes of communication, that trade is free and open, that the multilateral system works with money that is being funded or with the political support that the US gave. And then what we saw with Trump is that idea that had been creating underlying in the US, with Obama indicating that they needed to focus a little bit more in Asia, with the Asia pivot, or the reluctance of the US to fund the UN institution, or not to abide by the rulings of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So they were signs, but eventually those signs coalesced into an ideology, into a political movement of detachment, retreatment. We are gonna be more conscious about the cost-benefit analysis. We don't think in the long-term, mid-term consequences of our actions. We want short-term gains. And that was the first presidency of Trump from 2016 through 2018, 2019. And then I have an anecdote to share with the audience. I was working at the Spanish Prime Minister office in 2018.
And Bernardo, could you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Lokman.
Yes, just before moving, another question. I have one small detail. Just yesterday, I came across one post on X platform, formerly Twitter. One guy, he posted, he said, I think that all people in the Middle East have to vote in the United States, because the United States involving all the things, all the Middle East affairs. That's why the people have right to vote in the United States, because they decide our fates. This is very interesting. I think links maybe we can connect to the what kind of the world order. Just I want to ask from your perspectives. I want to know you from your perspectives. Just even before Venezuela, I still thought that we are in multipolar world order. But later, after Venezuela and just come to the Iran, I'm thinking maybe we are in, yes, maybe in terms of the technological bifurcation and the military power. Yes, maybe there is some pluralism, but when it comes to the military supremacy, I think we are in unipolar world order. What will be your thought?
Basically, the theories that I have always read and I have shared, and our mental framework is that you need to count how many great powers there are at the moment. And if you look at what a great power means, a great power is somebody that scores well enough in every single activity of human civilization. That means sport, culture, technology, military, economic, population, territory, allies. And if you look at this category, there are only 2 countries that fare well in every single one, in terms of like technology, in terms of military, in terms of population, in terms of economic growth, in terms of financial power, in terms of like cultural diffusion. And those are China and the US. So as we see, there are other countries that can think that they have certain power in 1 or 2 of these verticals of human civilization, like Russia in terms of like nuclear and energy, or the European Union in terms of population and trade. But really the only 2 real countries that fare well or very well in every single aspect of human civilization are 2. Which means, by theory and by the things that we look at through our lenses and our mental framework, that we have some kind of bipolarity. This is our hypothesis. And then if you check that hypothesis with the reality, I think that you can find signs that testify that that's right. Because you are seeing another things that we are seeing in bipolar world that are 2 different areas and 2 different geographies. You have 2 different internets, you have 2 different supply chains for semiconductors, you have 2 different military powers that are vast enough, that are number 1 and number 2, the first and the second largest spenders of military, expenditure. And this idea is that we are probably transitioning from being unipolar, in the way that the US led, to bipolar, in the way that there are only 2 countries that are powerful enough, nuclear weapons, economic growth, population, appeal, global appeal, cultures, sports, technology, internet, semiconductors. There are only 2 countries that fare well. That doesn't mean, of course, that there are other areas in which the influence of those 2 big great powers do not reach, or that there are other small countries or smaller countries, like the European Union or Russia, that in their own spheres of influence, they are touching to each other and they are trying to fight. But again, why we see and why we think that it confirms that we are in a bipolar world is that every single time that there is like a global event, people that are looking at global events, we ask, what does Washington think about this? What does Beijing think about it? We're not asking what New Delhi thinks about it, or we're not concerned about what Moscow thinks about artificial intelligence or about semiconductors, because we know they don't have any capability. So in every single crisis in the last 3-4 years, we're always asking, what is China doing? What the US is doing? Which means that pretty much everybody unconsciously recognizes that those are the ones calling the shots in most of the global problems.
And just Bernardo, let me connect my next questions about regarding the middle powers, because middle powers are rising in a different way, specifically in Middle East and maybe Northern Africa. So do you think that the recent escalations into a full regional war proves that the traditional rules-based order has finally collapsed in favor of a system that where middle powers set their own rules?
I mean, the thing is, even if you think this is a compatible idea with the fact that you may be seeing the rise of bipolarity, in the sense that what you know is the US is retreating and detaching from several areas, which means that those middle powers that were one constrained by the presence of US military or US political support, now they have room. every single country that was ruled politically by the US and was part of this set of allies, now they are feeling less pressure to follow Washington dictates, which means that if they have regional quarrels or regional fights, or like, for example, any other thing that they always wanted to obtain, but they couldn't because the US didn't allow, through political support, through military engagement, now they are free to do so. So since the US was projecting its global power through most of the geography and now is retreating and detaching a little bit, that means that the global space in which they have influence is decreasing. And that means that the middle powers that were in those frontiers, now they don't feel the pressure, so they can act. And in our opinion, that's the final reason why Russia saw that there was an opportunity to recover Ukraine. Because let's remember, the invasion or the attack happened in February 2022, but the discussions about the Putin wanted more area in Ukraine started in the summer of 2021 when the US detached from Afghanistan. So the learning of many analysts that were writing at the moment is the US is no longer abiding by their either explicit or implicit political and military obligations. And it was very well understood by Russia that the US was not going to provide military troops on the ground if Russia attack Ukraine. It was even told by the American ambassador in Ukraine that they were not going to hold the line, that it was just only up to Ukraine. And it was very tempting for Russia to obtain something that for them has always been something they have been longing for, couldn't get because of the strong power of a great power like the US in a unipolar time. But now that the power was retreating, they saw an opportunity. So you can see in every single area, in those areas of geography where the US is retreating, how all the fights that happened and were frozen in the last 20 to 30 years now that are open. And I think that Ukraine is one of those examples.
Looking at the intensity of the ongoing strikes on Iran, how do you see the shift toward multipolarity will affecting the cost-benefit analysis for leaders in Washington, whether in Tel Aviv, compared to previous decades?
I mean, this is a very good question, because the way we see the relationship between Israel and the US, and some analysts share this, and this is one of our mental frameworks when we look at this relationship, is that Israel is the 51st state of the US, which may be a little bit contradictory with the fact that we think that the states in this structural realism theory are independent and they don't talk to each other. But if you look at the relationship of the elites of the US and Israel since 1950, you have seen that pretty much they have, intertwined. There is like some kind of like quantum entanglement between the Israeli elites and the American elites. I'm sure that all the audience knows that pretty much there are like 14, 16 millions of Jews in the world. Half of them are located in Israel, the other half are located in Washington. And the vast leverage that they have in terms of political affiliations, financial support is so huge that Israel is able to steer and to govern some of the decision of the foreign policy of the US. This is not like a very original thesis, because I'm sure that you know that book by Mearsheimer and Walt that was published in 2007, 2008 in the US with the title of The Israeli Lobby, and pretty much denounced how Israel was able to hijack the process of foreign policy making in the US to always serve the interests of Israel in the region. So again, those are countries that should be thought as twins, as super connected and independent and dependent when it comes to the Middle East. And I think that we have several areas to understand, several points to confirm that when it comes to the Middle East, Israel has been able to convince the US to give Tel Aviv a free rein, pretty much do whatever you want. And that means that Netanyahu, because of also the internal politics and also the opportunity of an area in which the US has led Tel Aviv to dictate what's going to happen, is using its own Israeli military power and the US military power to try to obtain one of their own, the most important goals that they have, which is the survival within the region.
And how do you see a regional heavyweight like Iran asserting its strategic agency today in ways that simply wouldn't have been possible when the world was dominated by a one or two superpower?
I mean, this is this is also like a very interesting question and very relevant, because basically we can just compare how Iran behaved when there was a unipolar power, which was the United States in 2010 and 2005, 2008. And let's just remember, what we knew at the moment is that the US was expanded geographically at its most length, in terms of like it covered the most area of geography within the globe that we have ever seen. It was pretty much like the Pax Romana, like the Roman Empire. Also the Pax Americana, which meant that pretty much all of that area of influence was governed by the US. But there were limits and frontiers to that area, and that was Iran, basically. So we saw that Iran in 2005, I think that it was 2005 that they elected Prime Minister or President Ahmadinejad, and I think that his cabinet understood that the only way to stop the need and the impetus of the power of the US was to try to acquire nuclear weapons. And it was in 2005, 2006 that they started their nuclear program that eventually got the sanctions in 2009, 2010 by the United States and its ally. It was a very tough moment for Iran because it was a unipolar war. There was just only one major power. That was, at the time, China was not that powerful and was not that open, like to create a counterbalance to the US. And they resisted in 2010 through 2018 through 2020. So for 10 years, the Ayatollah regime was able to resist the US, was able to either acquire some capabilities or trade them for certain benefits in the 2015 nuclear agreement, the P5+1, the agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, when they got some relief of the sanctions in exchange of stopping for a while the nuclear armament. But now it's 2026, which means that the US is not that powerful. It is super powerful, but it's not that powerful in terms that for the last 10 years, for example, China has been providing a financial survival line to Iran. That means that when we have the full presence of American power in the 2000s and 2010s, the sanctions for Iranian oil were very strict, and it was super difficult for Iran to get revenues from its oil. Now in 2025, last year or this year, Iran is able to sell oil to other different parties, especially China, which again means that saying no in 2010 to an unipolar great power like the US was much more difficult than it is now, when there are another great power, China, that is providing you financial line, and at least is also giving you the opportunity to explore other markets, be it Russia, be it India, or in any case, be other parts that oppose the former preeminence of the US. So which means that the Ayatollah regime has today more space for maneuver for changing policies than it had in 2010, 2015.
And to understand these topics a little bit in details, I'm going to ask another questions regarding Iran. Do you think that the way Iran utilizes its network of proxies and asymmetric tactics will represent a new kind of sovereign path for countries that want to resist being absorbed into the Western or Eastern blocs?
I mean, this is a very good question. And again, if we were working in the cabinet of the Iranian prime minister or the Iranian president, we will arrive to a very simple conclusion, which is we cannot oppose head-to-head the military powers. We cannot go to war on the field like tank against tank or like soldier against soldier, because we're going to be overpowered militarily and technologically. So we have to look for all the different ways of engaging into war. And that opens up that concept in military studies that is asymmetric warfare, which is looking for the different ways of hurting your enemy, since the technological superiority of Israel and Iran is so vast. You look for the different ways to inflict or hurt your enemy. That means terrorism, that means using proxies in the region, or that means, for example, developing new cheap arms or weapons like drones. So at the end of the day, it's kind of like a straightforward. What Iran is doing is, since they cannot oppose head-to-head unconventional capabilities, tanks, ships, normal missiles, the US, they have been looking for different ways of hurting their enemy, which are asymmetrical. And then your list of proxies in the region, terrorism, or even you can include in that list the development of new cheap weapons, like, for example, drones.
Deterrence beyond its border.
What about it?
Yeah. And how do you see, Bernardo, how do you see the actions of other regional powers like Saudi Arabia and most recently, specifically Israel and another Qatar and UAE influencing the trajectory of this war as they move to protect their own strategic autonomy?
I mean, I'm not at all an expert, and I think, Lokman, you know a lot more about this, the Middle East area, than I do. What I can think is generally about this bipolar framework, from transitioning from one unipolar to one bipolar world, what it means for the region, and I think that it can provide some, general directions for you to fill in the details, because as I said, I'm not that knowledgeable of the area. But again, for many time, it was the US, the preeminence power in the Middle East, which meant that Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, all of them had wonderful and great relationship with the US. They were forced to, because if they were not to have those kind of like good relationships with the US, they were gonna have the same fate as Iran. Now that the US for the last 5 or 6 or 10 years has been detaching, you have started seeing, for example, Saudi Arabia to open up Chinese investment. And you have also seen Gulf Cooperation Council to start up to Chinese investment and relationship with China. Let's not forget, and I think that was, again, it shows, or I guess the way we take it is a sign that this is a bipolar world, or like very similar in that transition, that it was China who was able to broker the first meeting between Iran leadership and Saudi Arabia leadership, and I think that it was 2022, 2023, and never happened. Could that meeting have happened in 2010, 2005, 2012, when the US was the only great power and China was not present? Impossible, because Saudi Arabia, the neighbors were aligned with the US, and China did not offer any alternative, and it was just only sole, independently, Iran that was trying to resist American attacks. Now that it has appeared another power, you can see that Saudi Arabia is playing both. They are trying to maintain their relationship with the US in terms of like the military transfer and the economic opportunities, but at the very same time, they have also opened their economy up to Chinese investment. So I don't know enough about the details of the region, but I think that this is a dynamic that is worth exploring. And on top of that, one element that always makes the analysis a little bit difficult in the Middle East is the special relationship of Israel with the US, which basically means that Israel is able, to capture and play the US in favor of Israeli interests. And at the moment, they have seen the opportunity to try to establish dominance in Middle East.
And to what extent do you think that the ongoing war in the Middle East is actually a primary theater for larger competition between the United States and China?
And that's a good question. I would say, so like, for example, what we know regarding Venezuela. We know regarding Venezuela that the national security strategy and what theory tells us about what the US should do is pretty much the US is detaching, retreating, and they are trying to establish absolute dominance in a certain geographic area. That geographic area is the Western Hemisphere, which means that Canada, Mexico, Greenland, Panama, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Venezuela, they are all, and Cuba, they are all under the influence of the US. So that they are trying is, they are retreating, but they are making sure that their closest sphere of influence is dominated. And I think that you can see that in the developments in Greenland, in the developments in Canada and Mexico in terms of tariff and the trade agreements. And you can also see that in Venezuela, Colombia, and Cuba should be the next, according to this theory. Now, how you can see that can happen in the Middle East. I guess that we should be seeing the fact that since the US is not present anymore, the different fights and political conflicts between the Gulf Cooperation Council member states, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, those quarrels or those fights that were frozen because of the dominant presence of the US, now they open up. And now there is a space to establish new hierarchies in the Middle East. And the interesting presence also of China, which is rising in terms of like nowadays the other great power that you can count on. They can help you. They can help you. With military support. They can help you with financial opportunities, investment opportunities. So they are also a huge off-taker of some of the oil of the region. That allows for regional middle powers in the Middle East not only to look for one ally, which is the US, but also look for other different kind of allies, in this case, China, in what we call a hedging strategy, in the sense of like now Saudi Arabia can hedge between being dependent or being military aligned with the US and also economically and financially aligned with China. And that opens up a space for a new power hierarchy in the region.
And do you see a new Cold War as an inevitable backdrop to the conflict, or is the current situation in the Middle East creating a new, unique set of alliances that defies those old labels?
I mean, it's a good question. I would say that, like globally, if we talk about the Earth, I think that we are seeing a Cold War in terms of like there is only China, there is only the US, the bipolar structure, that's only two great power. Who can talk about artificial intelligence, semiconductors, internet, space with, like enough power, knowledge, experience, and bureaucracies to back it up? Just only China and the US. Who has the two largest military budgets of the world? The US and China, which means that pretty much we are seeing who is competing against each other every single time. How many gold medals did the US win in the last Olympics versus how many medals did China win? So basically, I think that globally we are seeing that. That doesn't mean, and the areas of friction between these two superpowers are very clear, which is the Indo-Pacific. So you can see why both are focused on that area in terms of like the US saying we have to control our West hemisphere because that's our closest neighborhoods, and now we have to detent and stop China from advancing in the Indo-Pacific. And for China, it's pretty much the same. They are trying to establish dominance in their closest neighborhood and also try to expand Taiwan, the first, the first line of island, the second line of island, and also the other in the Pacific. What happens with the Middle East? That is not a real and absolute clear line of confrontation between both of them. It is a line in which the US had already been there for many, many years. They were trying to detangle through the Abraham Accords, but because of the weird and strange relationship they had with Israel, they cannot really fully implement their policy of detaching from the Middle East because of Israel. So now in the Middle East, what we have is a specific experiment of how all former powers that were either independent, like Iran, and they paid the price for it, and also other middle powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, that were a little bit more closely aligned with the US, but also trying to establish their independence. Now they have room for competition, because now it's not Washington who is dictating who is first, who is getting what, but now it's up to them to decide or to have a conflict about what kind of new hierarchy. So I don't know enough about the region, but the hierarchy that established, I don't know, the Saudi Arabia was the most important, and the all Gulf Cooperation Council member states were part of the Saudi Arabia coalition, and that was always opposed with Iran and was always opposed with Turkey. I don't know enough about the detail, but that previous hierarchy now is not sustained by the American power. There is another partner that you can count on, so it's up for grabs, that situation.
Regarding the strategic autonomy of European Union and NATO, how do you see the recent shifts in regional balance of power forcing a total rethink for a strategic autonomy for these two blocks, European Union and NATO, in this part of the world?
Oh, you mean specifically in the Middle East?
No, European Union, and how will affect European strategic autonomy of European Union and NATO in the future?
So, I mean, the way we see how the European Union is behaving is Brussels and all the European Union member states were always focusing on the US for many years. For 60 years and for 30 years for the Eastern European countries like Poland and the Baltic states, it was always the US who provided them with security, defense, and economic opportunities. Something changed in 2019, 2020 with the first, and specifically was also in motion with the Biden presidency, but also with eventually it was confirmed by the second election of the Trump presidency. That basically what we see and say in the company is that now the US has become a source of transatlantic insecurity for European Union. So basically in structural terms, what we saw and we see is that Europe was a close ally of the US for many years. They realized in 2020, 2021, that the US was detaching from them, was not giving them, the first presidency of Trump gave you a lot of examples. Also, the Biden administration gave you a lot of examples in which the US was no longer a reliable ally. In terms of economic opportunities, funding, like for example, the subsidies that Biden introduced for the American economy that stole a lot of European companies from Europe to America. So you could see at the moment that the US was not the ally that it used to be, which basically started all this process of thinking about how we become more independent. Fortunately enough for the European Union, we had the French and some other analysts that in 2017 and 2018, they already started talking about we need to gain independence. And we coined and created this concept that now is almost an ideology, which is strategic autonomy, which means, again, trying to create as many capabilities as we can in military, economic, finance, technology, semiconductors, quantum, in every single area we're trying to create. What's the problem? That still the transatlantic links between the US and Europe have like 5 or 6 decades, are the 5 or 6 decades old. So it's going to take a lot of, and it's taking a lot of time, and it's taking a lot of pain, because there are some countries that have already seen that we need to become more independent and to hedge between the US and China, and thus the attitude and the behavior of France, of Spain. And there are other countries, and even some parts of Germany, but there are other countries that are still too aligned, or that are still very aligned with the US, like for example, Poland, the Baltic states, and a certain part of Germany. So what you are seeing now at the moment in the European Union is this desire of trying to get independence, because we can no longer rely with the US, and we have to oppose creating dependencies with China. But this is taking time, and this is taking a lot of like political conflict in terms of like different voices arguing from different movements. So our hypothesis is that this is going to be convergent into creating enough capabilities at the European Union, and it's going to take decades. But this is a development to see. And then related to the European Union interest in the region, basically the Middle East is many reasons, but like the European Union is quite interested in a certain stability in the Middle East in terms of like trade, because most of the trade go through that area in order to arrive to the European Union. Energy, though at the very same time, it's also true that we are trying to gain energy independence, and that's why the European Union is betting on green renewables and green energy. And finally, the issue of immigration, because it was very painful but for the European Union, and I'm sure that you remember this, the Syrian crisis, the migration flows that go through Turkey in 2015, and how those migration flows eventually arrived into Germany and created some of the far-right anti-immigrant political movements. So the interest of the European Union is to make sure that there is some kind of stability and some kind of order. In other words, everybody is happy between the different arrangements of states in the Middle East to allow for free trade, to allow for free flow of energy, fossil fuels, and then to be able to not to generate immigration like it happened in the Syrian crisis.
And just Bernardo, a little bit talking about the role of AI and emerging tech in the geopolitics of international or relations of multipolar world order. I think the AI will definitely be one of the most important revelation in that case, and would have many ramifications for regional confrontations and the great power competition. In these aspects specifically, when we go to the AI, the revelation that following these technological developments and in deep technology, how these technologies will fundamentally shifting the balances of power between the traditional military powers and emerging regional actors.
Well, this is a very good question. Again, a very, very good question, because I mean, even if we are Marxist or we like the communist theory of history, technology changes the relationship of labor and capital and allows you to do many more things with the same amount of labor. And what we are seeing is that pretty much the efficiency of and the use of labor and capital can increase by, like 10,000-fold or like many folds the amount of economic and social output that a country generates. So so what we are seeing is that, needless to say, there is a technology that allows to create more power in terms of economic output, social output, military output. And whoever is able to implement and get the benefits the quickest of this new technology is able to have more power and then impose their will and that power onto others. That's the general use of technology in the history of international relations. Like, whoever got the powder and guns and pistols and guns before the other was able to assert more influence. The British Empire in Africa or in Asia is a clear example. They had the machine gun and they were with another technology to have a new technology to have more military output than the enemy, so an opportunity to impose their will. Now we're seeing pretty much the same. The only thing that we don't know, or like is still up to be seen, is whether AI is easily communicated, or there's this concept in international relations and technology, which is technological diffusion, which is the fact that there is a certain technology and the owner of that technology can protect others to obtain it or cannot protect others to obtain it, and is easily diffused. For example, during the Cold War, at the beginning of the Cold War, that technology was nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons are very difficult to create. You need a bureaucracy. You need several years of investment. You need human capital. You need education. You need to have a lot of engineers and good infrastructure and a lot of spending for many, many years. So even if you were able to steal the academic paper or the handbook of how to create a nuclear bomb, it was very difficult for other countries to really impose and to really create that. And that's why the technological diffusion of that new technology, nuclear weapons, was not very high, and that's why we only have a certain amount of countries that have nuclear weapons, because those that had nuclear weapons prevented others from having. With AI, the question now, or like what we know, is for sure it's going to create a lot of power in terms of economic, military, and social output. That country that is able to implement artificial intelligence in their military is going to be more powerful. You're going to make better military choices. You're going to have more impact in their military decisions. What we don't know, or I guess at least I don't know, and I have seen a couple of papers that are discussing, is whether artificial intelligence is going to be, again, a technology that going to have huge entry cost and it's going to be very difficult to duplicate, or if it's going to be something that is going to be diffused, it's going to be shared with all the other countries, so the relative power of every single country is not going to increase too much. Let's go with the first. It's only China and it's only the US who are able to achieve artificial intelligence, and they are able to control the technological diffusion, which means that they are the only ones that have, let's call, artificial general intelligence, or like the most advanced models. That means that the American military and the Chinese military are going to be hyper powerful, and they are going to prevent other countries they are going to prevent other countries to obtain that technology. In that scenario, you will have even a much more bipolar world, because there will be two different countries which are largely separate in terms of power creation with the others. Or let's go to the other extreme. Artificial intelligence is something that middle powers can copy. Okay, so then you have a situation in which the general well-being of each country increases in terms of each country is able to obtain AI models that allow them to increase their economic, military, and social and cultural output enough in order to be able to resist attacks by the other great powers. And in that case, it would be a technology that will help for multipolarity, you see, because there will be more medium powers that are able to obtain artificial intelligence and increase their power relative to the great powers. So it depends, and I don't know enough, if artificial intelligence is much more similar to nuclear weapons in terms of like those that have it protected from others, or if it's a technology that is generally shared with all the different countries, and then it equalizes the relative differences of power between countries. That's our take, at least.
And Bernardo, as you rightly mentioned, how to creation of the nuclear weapons was difficult during the Cold War, unipolar world order, bipolar world order. It required, the investments of, as you mentioned, engineers, human capitals, financial capitals, get acceptance from the international community, and so forth, so on. But since in addition to in this new area with the advancements in technology, in addition to the artificial intelligence, together there is autonomous systems, cyber warfare, electronic warfare capabilities, and these are, as we see maybe in Ukraine, they try to change the nature of the war. For example, the Iran's Shahid drones. When we come to the Israel, when Iran launch over the Israel, sometimes it can lead to the saturation of the air and missile defenses. Maybe the cost is 50 to 100,000 USD. They sometimes can be intercepted by million of the air missile defense, and all these things really, they bring different order in terms of the regional, or as you say, they give the opportunity of the copy paste to the new actors, regional powers, small countries. Since the war is ongoing, I'm going to ask my specific questions related to the Iran. Do you think that these, specifically the drones or other autonomous vehicles, has been employed by Iran toward the US missile defense in the region? Do you think that it will be enough to destroy the US or Israeli naval missile defenses or land missile defenses? Because some reports from Iranian media, they argued that they already destroyed many missile defenses in the region. But do you think that to what extent it will be possible through this new technology?
I mean, also it's a very relevant question. Again, drones is another technology that, like it was lying over there. We know about drones for like 20 years. But eventually, as we said in Great Power Politics, technology is political. It needs somebody that takes it and puts it to a political use. So, again, we see the US was so powerful that was focusing on conventional capabilities, tanks, ships, aircraft carriers, F-35s, and other small powers or middle powers were looking for different ways of trying to look for an advantage, an edge. And drones appear in terms of like they realized that they were able to produce massively. And it was a technology that was easily diffused, easily shared. So that's why they have been able to build certain capabilities that now are able to inflict certain pain. Related to the current political developments in the Iran war or Iran crisis, it is always difficult because what you are seeing at the end of the day are press statements from every single side of the war. So it's very difficult to have a full picture of who is winning, who is making some advantages. And the way we see at these conflicts is you have to look for secondary sources or secondary movements from each side. In that sense, for example, you know that the US last week were having several public discussions in media related to the cost of the war, saying that the Shahed drones were worth $30,000 versus the Interceptor. The Interceptor missile normally was worth something around 3 billion, 5 billion, 11 million in some extremes. And we know that Trump called for a meeting with Raytheon and with Lockheed, like two major defense companies, in order to look for solutions and in order to look for anti-drone system. And we also saw the news in the Financial Times that the US was asking Ukraine in order to learn from Ukraine how Ukraine has been able to stop some of the Iranian drones that are used by Russia. So again, I don't really trust the press releases of each side of the confrontation. I don't trust Iranian, Israeli, or the US press releases, but I normally focus, and our company, we normally focus on those lateral movements. And what we saw is that the US is concerned about the cost and the difference of cost between drones and the drone interceptor, that they had a meeting with the defense companies in order to speed up the production of anti-drone systems. And then we know that there were several phone calls between the Pentagon and the Ukrainian army asking Ukraine to provide some assistance about how to stop drones, which again, without relying on press statements from the parties that are in the conflict, what you are seeing is at least the US is concerned about the amount of pain that drones are creating. So I think that you can feel confident about making that assumption. And then another political thing is that the objective of the US and the Israel is much more difficult. The military objective is much more difficult to obtain. Regime change, total capitulation. These are very extreme outcomes of any conflict. While for Iran it's a little bit more, simple. The only thing that they have to do is survive and resist and saturate the other, the other airspaces with drones. So I would say that then you have this idea that the objectives of the US and Israel are super difficult to obtain, while the objectives of the Iranian regime are quite easy. So, and again, it's more difficult to sustain, to politically sustain and show support for regime change or full-fledged American operations in the region than to survive, because your community, your political community, your citizenship, your regime, the Ayatollah regime, and all the partners that they have within the country are committed to survive. So different kind of engagement, different difficulties trying to obtain those objectives. So again, we don't rely and we don't feel reliable press releases from the parties in the conflict, but you have to look at all the different things that are happening around to have some idea of how it's going on.
And as we're looking ahead, what comprehensive strategies do you think that specific decision makers must adopt right now and to navigate this unpredictable multipolar world, while the foundations of the Middle East are being reshaped, or not even Middle East, in Western Hemisphere, in Central America, in Northeast Asia? What will be specifically, you as a person, you had chance to working with the Kenneth Waltz? What will be your featured predictions?
Sorry, I think that you asked the question at the very beginning and I didn't quite catch it.
My question was about the future predictions and how the decision makers should understand. And later I added that I said, as a person you had chance to working with Kenneth Waltz, what will be your future predictions?
At our company, we think that this is a bipolar world, in terms which means that the US is going to try to protect a close neighborhood and their own sphere of influence, which is going to be the Western Hemisphere on part of the Indo-Pacific. We think that the only competitor at that level is going to be China, which is going to try to do the same. And that's going to create an expansion of their influence in certain areas, Indo-Pacific. So you have the US and China that they conflict in the Indo-Pacific. But if you go to the other part of the globe, of the Earth, there is an area which is Eurasia, basically Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which are up for grabs, which means that those are countries. Some of them are going to be aligned with the US, some of them are going to be aligned with China, and the middle powers are going to try to get as independent as they can. Who can try to be as independent as they can at the moment? We think that only the European Union. Russia is not powerful enough. India is not powerful enough. They can hedge a little bit, but they are going to have to rely a little bit more on one or the other. And the European Union is the only one that, because of the market size, because of the technology, because of the economic output and certain things that they have, is able to obtain some kind of a strategic autonomy. The rest of the country, Turkey should try to go for it. Saudi Arabia would try to go for it. Every single middle power is going to try to do it. And again, our prediction is that some of them will be able to obtain kind of like a high level of independence from the rest of the countries. Some of them, others are not going to be able to do that. So what you are going to see in the region, which is in Europe, you are going to see this movement of trying to get a strategic autonomy, and China and the US pressing for their own interests. In the Middle East, it's up for grabs, as I said, because the previous order was dominated by the US. The US is no longer there. So now other countries, Iran or Saudi Arabia, can start talking with China. How is going to that inflict on the relationship with Israel? Turkey can also do that. So I guess I don't know enough about the area, but I guess that the prediction for the region is that there is going to be a lot of political movement, and sometimes that means conflict.
Bernardo, thank you very much for these great answers and your observations through the history and time.
Thank you very much, Lokman. It's a pleasure, and hope that it has been useful. I don't know if sometimes I have gotten a little bit too long, but I really wanted to share our ideas with your audience and with you.
Yes, from specific, the format of my shows is try to be different than mainstream media or traditional television shows, which they sometimes take 5 minutes from the war skins or try to understand the regional war over the 30 minutes. I just try to make a little bit different and contribute to the international affairs, our area, in some valuable things together with my guests. Thank you very much again for your kindness for joining my show.
Lokman, thank you very much, and I think that you are making it real. You are really providing a lot of a space for thought with your podcast and with your audience.
Thank you very much, and thank you for our friends, followers. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel, share the link with your networks, with your friends, and stay tuned for our upcoming live stream shows.